Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this month's webinar. Today's webinar is titled SDTM Trial Summary Domain Puzzle. Are these the right pieces? My name is Kristin Kelly. I'm a principal consultant at Pinnacle 21. This September, I will have been there for 4 years. Before joining Pinnacle, I have worked at various pharma and CROs, primarily in data standards. I'm also act as an SME for several non-clinical and clinical FDA projects for both CDER and CBER. And in terms of CDISC, I am currently the incoming lead of the CDISC SDS team. That is the team that's responsible for compiling the SDTMIG. If at any time you have questions during the webinar, you can simply enter them via the chat feature. We will try to answer as many questions at the end that we can as time allows. But after the webinar, we will definitely compile those questions and we will post any remaining questions and answers to our website, pinnacle21.com. So why is the trial summary domain so important? Mostly because now the FDA requires that the data set be submitted for SDTM, SEND, as well as legacy data. The presence of this data set, as well as the study start date, will be handled by the soon-to-be implemented FDA Technical Rejection Criteria, and they are set to be officially, turned on September 15th of this year. So it will check for the presence of a TS data set as well as the study start date, so that the FDA can determine if CDISC standards should have been used for that particular clinical trial. So any study that starts on or after December 17, 2016, they should be using CDISC standards. And so that's why it's important to also submit a simplified TS dataset, which is explained in the FDA Technical Conformance Guide, even for legacy data, so that that study start date can be checked. So at the validation level, we have several rules that have been published that check the adherence to the FDA expectations of the content of this data set, as well as rules that check for the conformance to the guidance in the SDTMIG. So being able to construct an informative and complete TS domain can be challenging at times when you're trying to interpret the guidance that's out there, whether it be the SDTMIG or the Technical Conformance Guide, and knowing which reference terminologies to use for it. So just as a reminder, the trial summary domain definition is that it's a trial level data set, so there's no subject level information in it, that allows for the submission of a high level overview of the study in a structured format. So that's the definition from the SDTMIG. Each record in this data set contains a value of a parameter or a characteristic of the trial. You'll find certain basic information about the study, such as the trial phase, the title, how many subjects there were, any trial objectives. And the important thing to note is that this data set contains both planned and actual aspects of the trial, whether it be the number of subjects, the study start date, the study end date. And so while it might make sense to start constructing your TS data set before this trial even starts, you're always going to have to go back and update it later for those actual aspects of your trial. This is just a screenshot of the specification table for trial summary. Notice that because it is a trial level data set, we don't have the uSubjID variable. The topic variable is TS-PARM code, and that would contain the name of the parameter, as well as the description of it in TS-PARM. We have the TS-val or parameter value variable that would contain the value for that particular parameter. Also, beginning with SDTMIG version 3.13, we added some additional variables to trial summary. For basically when that TS-val variable could not be populated, there's another variable that can be used called parameter null flavor, which would contain a code from the ISO 21090 null flavor enumeration that would say why is TS-val null in that particular instance, whether it be not applicable to the study or not available, etc. We also have TS-val code. That would be any associated code with the value that's in TS-val. We also have TS-VCD-ref, which is the name of the reference terminology that was used for that particular parameter in TS-val. And then if that particular reference terminology is versioned, such as CDISC controlled terminology, that would go into the TS-VCD-VER variable. So there's lots of different resources that will help a sponsor or implementer create this domain. Most notably, we start with the SDTMIG. In the SDTMIG, there's an Appendix C1 that lists the minimum set of parameters that should be included in TS. We have different conditionality or core for specific parameters that are listed in this appendix. So those that are listed as required in this appendix means that the record for that particular parameter or TS parm and parm code needs to be added to the trial summary domain. Parameters that are conditionally required, they would be included based on some particular condition. And then we also have, if applicable, parameters that can be included as needed if they apply to your particular trial. Also from CDISC, they maintain a trial summary code table that provides more detailed information on the TS parameters that are subject to the CDISC controlled terminology. So in this screenshot here, we have the trial summary parameter test code for intervention model. And then off to the right here, we have the specific NCI code list that's associated and the terms that would go into TS-val. So it's kind of like a value level representation for the parameters, for those parameters that are subject to CDISC controlled terminology. Also, the FDA requires specific parameters in the trial summary domain. For clinical, they are listed in Appendix B. Some of these that are listed here are not listed in Appendix C1 of the SDTMIG, but they are in NCI controlled terminology. There's not as much detail in the TCG for some of the parameters in terms of like what code list to use, etc., as compared to the SDTMIG, but they do tell you which ones are required, or in this case, they're saying FDA desired. So any time that this column is populated with a Y means that it should be included in the trial summary domain. And then there's also conditional parameters listed similar to the appendix in the SDTMIG. And then there are notes for those conditional parameters of when they might be included. So in this example, we have cur treat. It's a conditional parameter. And so when the trial summary parameter for add-on is set to Y, then you would include this parameter. So Pinnacle 21 has created many validation rules that check for the presence of the required and conditionally required parameters that are based on the list in the SDTMIG Appendix C1. And this is the list of them here, meaning a record needs to be included for those required parameters. We have some conditional rules as well. So down here we have SD 1308 that is looking for the cur treat parameter when add-on is set to Y, and so that will fire if you have add-on set to Y, but do not have a cert treat. And then SD 1309, the treat parameter is missing when study type is interventional. So we also check for those conditionally required parameters as well. Based on what's in the TCG, Pinnacle 21 also has several validation rules that check for those FDA desired parameters. And so here's a list of them here. And so you will get a warning that fires if you do not include these FDA desired parameters in your data set. It's always better to simply update your trial summary data set, even though some of these might not be applicable to your study, rather than having to explain them in the SDRG. So I would recommend that these FDA desired parameters also be included. So in general, sponsors have been adding these parameters, but there are still many that do not include them. Just in the reviews that I've done, I do still see a lot of these FDA desired parameter rules firing, and then they're being explained in the SDRG. So here's an example of a few that fired, one for the SDTMIG version, one for the extension trial indicator, and then one for the therapeutic area trial summary parameter. And they explain for a couple of these, the parameters not listed in the SDTMIG, thus not required to be included. And I do see that explanation a lot, that because it's not in the IG, they don't have to include it. Something else that I see is that the study is not an extension, so the parameter is not applicable for the study. I see a lot of explanations like that. So just to reiterate, just because they're not listed in the SDTMIG, they are expected by the FDA. So it is not really optional to include them when it's set as FDA desired equals Y in Appendix B. Parameters should be added to TS so the validation rules no longer fire, and these rules should not be explained in the SDTMIG. So we should not see these explanations at all in the reviewer's guide. The parameters should be added to TS to have a complete trial summary domain. We also have validation rules that check against the CDIS control terminology at the value and parameter level, as well as checking the values of TS-PARM code and TS-PARM. So I'm sure a lot of industry is familiar with CT 2001, variable value not found in an non-extensible code list. Also CT 2002, that a variable value wouldn't be found in an extensible code list. CT 2003 checks that paired variables like test and test code, or in this case, TS-PARM and PARM code, share the same values as in CDIS controlled terminology. And then CT 2004, 5, and 6, these are actually checking controlled terminology at the value level. So here's an example of one of these rules. CT 2003, variable and variable decode values do not have the same code in CDIS CT. Again, this is checking paired variables. So like test and test code in CDIS controlled terminology have separate code lists, but their concept code or C code should still match. So this rule will fire when those paired values that share the same C code have a submission value that matches CDIS controlled terminology, but one of them, the other one does not. For trial summary, CT 2003 is checking TS-PARM code and PARM, similar to test and test code. Both of them have a CDIS submission value with the same C code. And this is just a snippet from CDIS controlled terminology for the CTALG, CDIS Therapeutic Area User Guide, TS-PARM and PARM code. Notice they have different code list names and different code list codes because they're in separate code lists, but they share the same concept code or C code because they are paired variables. So here's an example of when the rule fired for a study. So I highlighted the value that doesn't match the CDISC control terminology. So in this example, we have the exploratory objective parameter, and then we also have it firing for the name of the epidemic or pandemic parameter, TS-PARM and PARM code. Also in this instance, CT 2002 will fire. So when you're trying to investigate CT 2003, it might not be, readily apparent which is the value that's not in CDISC controlled terminology. But if you look at CT 2002, it'll tell you which value does not match controlled terminology. And so CT 2003 should be easy to investigate and fix based on that. So here's an example of an SDRG explanation I saw for CT 2003. And they explain that there's nothing wrong with their data. It's a false positive error within P21 tool. If I only had $1 every time I saw someone explaining that it was a false positive. And then they go on to say that the values below are populated correctly as shown for the TS-PARM codes, and then the TS-PARM, which for trial exploratory objective clearly has a typo in it. They actually went into the validation report, copied it out with the typo in it, and then said it was a false positive. This is not a false positive. This should have been corrected, and it should have not been explained in the reviewer's guide. So this one should have been fixed as well. Other validation rules that we have for trial summary: check the format and the data type in TS-Val, because this is outlined in the SDTMIG Appendix C1 for certain parameters. So some of them, we have date parameters. We also have parameters that the TS-Val value should be a number for the number of arms. I'm highlighting the TS-Val value for study start date because it needs to be in ISO 8601 format. And this will also be checked via the FDA Technical Rejection Criteria to make sure that it is in the proper ISO 8601 format. We also have validation rules that check that TS-Val and TS-Val code are matching external dictionaries as well. So things such as SNOMED, we have MedRT, or we have the FDA UNII, or Unique Ingredient Identifier Dictionary for specific parameters. So the first one we're going to mention is SNOMED. These are applicable for the trial indication and trial diagnosis group parameters. And these are the rules listed that check those. We have two separate rules that check TS-Val and TS-Val code, as well as whether the TS-Val and TS-Val code actually go together per the SNOMED dictionary. We also have rules that check against MedRT for TS-PARM code pharmacological class. And these are these rules here, again, checking separately TS-Val and Val code, and then that the term and code actually go together. Also in our description, we explain that the NDFRT was renamed to the MedRT in 2018. We also have rules that check against the FDA Unique Ingredient Identifier Dictionary. So this dictionary would be applicable for the CUR-TREAT or current therapy parameter, the comparative treatment name parameter, and the investigational treatment parameter. Again, checking separately TS-Val, TS-Val code, and then the paired term and code against the dictionary. So we're going to talk about these three for treatment, for the investigational treatment, and some updates that Pinnacle 21 did to refine some of these rules checking against the UNII. So SD 2260, 61, and 62 check against that treat parameter. So the UNII dictionary places substances into 5 discrete categories with a corresponding term and code for each. So these 5 categories are, we have OF for official status. It used to be called the PT or preferred term, but has changed to OF. And so that's what you'll see in the dictionary for each term and code pair. We also have CN for common name, SYS for systemic name, CD for code, and then BN for brand name. So prior to September 2019, these rules were only looking for the OF or the official status term code based on FDA feedback. And so over time, these rules, those for the cur-treat and com-treat parameters, as well as the treat parameters, sometimes they return false positives for drugs that did not yet have a term and code in that OF or official status category. But then when you went to search for these in the UNII dictionary, they were returning a term and code for those. Most likely because they didn't have an OF term and code, but they did have one in those other 4 discrete categories. So here's an example of when it was found in the UNII dictionary for this penicillin G benzenine. The UNII code is there. Here is a snippet of the data set. So here's our treat parameter. They have TS-val penicillin, benzenine, and then the TS-val code is populated with the UNII code that goes with that term, as well as what dictionary it is and the version that was used. But even though it matched what was on the UNII website, these 3 rules still fired for our treat parameter. And so, at first we had to investigate, why was this happening? Why was it returning these false positive errors? So we sent an email to the FDA CDER eData team to ask them if only the OF or official status terms and codes be used in trial summary. And their response was that there was no preference at this time as to what term category they should be using. So we at Pinnacle 21, we actually removed the filter that only looked for official status terms and codes. And so it should now look at all categories. And so those rules for cur-treat, com-treat, and treat, they should no longer fire as long as the term and code in TS-val and val code matches what's in the UNII dictionary. So this reduced a lot of false positives just by refining the rule and removing that filter that we had in place. And then our last category for our validation rules for trial summary, we do have rules that check the consistency between what's in the TS dataset and the defined.xml. SD 1228 is saying that it can't find the term in your defined.xml for a specific parameter, but it is in your dataset. We have SD 1229. We also have SD 1230, which checks the data type. And then SD 1231 checks the length based on the consistency between what's noted in your define versus what's in your data set. So we get a lot of questions specifically about SD 1229. The description of this rule is the variable value must be populated when the value level attribute of mandatory, which is a defined.xml attribute, is set to yes, as specified in the defined.xml file. So this rule is triggered when the variable is null at the value level in the data set, but the mandatory attribute in the define.xml code is set to yes. So we get questions about this rule a lot. So perhaps we should start thinking about, adding to the description to make it more clear what this rule is actually checking. So when you look in the define.xml 2.0 guidance for the mandatory element, it says the following. So for SDTM-based variables where the core is required, and when we say required, we mean that it must be present in the data set and it must be populated. And so for required variables in SDTM, the value of mandatory should be yes, meaning it cannot be null. And then for variables where the core is expected or permissible and the sponsor does not require a more restrictive condition, mandatory should be set to no. If there is a chance that the variable doesn't have to be populated on every single record. So this happens a lot with findings domains where you might not have a result. So ORES and stress T and stress N would be null, but you collected not done, so you populated the stat variable instead. So mandatory should be set to no for ORES, stress C, and stress N, as well as stat. Variables where mandatory is set to yes cannot be null in the data set, because it's just a reflection of what's actually in your data. So here's an example of when SD1229 fired. It appears for trial summary most often when TS-val is null and TS-val null flavor is used instead, because we can't populate TS-val for whatever reason for a required parameter. And then mandatory is set to yes in the define.xml. So here's a snippet from the trial summary dataset for a pharmacological class. Sometimes if you have a new class of drugs, it might not be present in the medRT dictionary. And so in that case, we leave TS-val null, and then we populate TS-val null flavor as NAV or not available. So when it does become available, we can actually go back and update our TS data set. But for the purpose of submission, it's at the time of submission, it's just not available yet. Here is also our define.xml code for this value level parameter. And you notice that for P class, mandatory set to yes. And then also looking at our Pinnacle 21 report, this is from the validation report where the rule did fire, because mandatory was set to yes and TS-val is null. So per the SDTMIG, since TS-val can be null when a value cannot be provided for a parameter, the mandatory attribute should be set to no in the define.xml, and this rule will no longer fire. So in order to rectify this rule, you would need to go into the define.xml code, or if you are using Enterprise, you go into the define generator, you would find that parameter in your value level metadata, and you would change the mandatory attribute from yes to no. And so this is another rule that should not be explained in the SDRG. I just wanted to point out that in terms of issues with the define.xml itself, as well as issues with the consistency between the data sets and the define, they should always be fixed, because it's just metadata. It's not your actual data, it is just metadata. And so that consistency between the two should be fixed in the define to reflect the actual values. Just want to reiterate again, when you go to submission, there should be no define.xml related issues for your study. And so they should not be explained. They should always be fixed. So future plans for trial summary domain resources, all that guidance that we need to construct a comprehensive trial summary domain. So currently we have the TCG, we have the SDTMIG, including Appendix C1, and we also have the trial summary code table from CDISC. But just wanted to point out that beginning with the SDTMIG version 3.4, which is not yet published, but is expected to be published by the end of this year, that Appendix C1 is going to be removed. And they added an assumption to explain why. It basically says that recipients, meaning regulatory agencies, for which trial summary parameters should be included under which circumstances. So CDISC has said they no longer want to maintain those trial summary parameters because they're really a regulatory requirement. So the US FDA has their Appendix B for clinical trials parameters, and so the technical conformance guide should be referred to instead. But in addition to the TS code table, CDISC also recently published resources that are similar to both the TS code table, which I mentioned contains the information that are for the parameters that are subject to controlled terminology, and that Appendix C1 that tells you what code list goes with which parameter. It actually provides that linkage that's needed that between the variables and the value level metadata, as well as the reference terminologies and the code lists. That's based on the SDTMIG version 3.2. So they actually use all the full list from Appendix C1, as well as the CDISC controlled terminology TS PARM code list parameters. This was recently published as the CDISC-CT relationships version 1.0 for SDTM 1.4 and SDTMIG version 3.2. So as a resource, you can go onto the CDISC website and get this value level table that actually also includes external terminologies, such as UNII, MedRT, etc. So just to conclude, it is well known in the industry by this time that the trial summary dataset is required for all submissions, regardless of whether the data is submitted using CDISC standards or as legacy data, so that they can check that study start date. It can be quite difficult to create an informative and complete trial summary domain due to so many sources of guidance, like the SDTMIG, the TCG, CDISC controlled terminology. We have a lot of different resources. Pinnacle 21 has implemented hundreds of validation rules in order to help sponsors, get to that comprehensive and conformant trial summary domain. And it's also important when we're following regulatory and standards guidance, it's necessary in order to facilitate a quick and expedient review of your data in an effort to get drugs to patients faster. And that takes us to the question portion of our webinar. So let me take a quick minute to see what may have come in. Okay, so the first one is a question that's asked for every single webinar, and that is, where can I get the slides? So the slides will be posted to our website, pinnacle21.com, in the coming weeks. You will get an email notifying you that they have been posted. There will also be a recording of this webinar available as well. And the next one. FDA several times updated a list of required trial summary parameters in the technical conformance guide. What should we do when submitting study completed several years ago? Is it okay to keep a historical list of trial summary parameters requested at the time of study completion, or do we need to update our trial summary domain according to the latest requirements from FDA? So as I mentioned, I would recommend adding the requested parameters to TS. This would be a better approach in my opinion than having to explain all those validation rules at FHIR if they're not included. I mean, trial summaries, it's not all based on, clinical database data. It's a trial level data set. And so it should be very easy to add those parameters and populate TS-val or TS-val null flavor if it's not applicable for your study. A lot of those new parameters from the FDA are indicator questions of just yes or no. And so if it's not applicable to your study, you would just have a TS-val of N for no. The next one is, I've received a false positive validation message like invalid NA value for TS-val. When will Pinnacle fix these checks? Some required parameters are not applicable for my study. I tried 3 different options. Did not include those parameters in TS. Option 2 was use a missing value for TS-val. And 3 was to used NA value for TS-val. In all cases, I received validation errors. So when TS-val cannot be populated for a required trial summary parameter, meaning a record needs to be included in the data set, that TS-val null flavor variable should be used instead. So in the example that you gave, that not applicable should be populated in TS-val null flavor rather than TS-val. Actually, the code should be NA from the ISO 21090 standard, actually, not the words not applicable. If you make this update, the rule should no longer fire. So you just need to use that TS-val null flavor variable instead. Next question. What should I do when versions of UNII, MedRT, or SNOMED are unknown? Right, so if you're the one doing the validation but might not have put together that trial summary domain, it is recommended in the FDA Data Standards Catalog that the latest versions of the dictionaries be used. So if you don't know what the version was, I would just recommend to validate against the most recent version available. And if you are an enterprise user, when you configure your study, the latest version of each of those dictionaries will be automatically selected for you. So you don't have to worry about setting it if you're always following the guidance in the Data Standards Catalog and using the latest version. So we'll take a couple more questions. Here's one. Do I need to populate value level metadata in the define.xml file for each trial summary parameter? So for trial summary is a little different from, say, a findings domain where you have a lot of value level metadata. But like it's different because TS, you usually just have one record for each parameter. And so it's usually not necessary to create value level metadata in addition. It's really just a sponsored decision whether you want to include value level metadata for TS or not. And if you're using the defined generator in Enterprise, that's actually one of the choices to create value level metadata for TS-val, if you'd like. Another question, where can I find a full list of required trial summary parameters from CDISC and FDA? So as I mentioned, we have that Appendix C1 in the SDTMIG. That'll be removed starting with SDTMIG version 3.4. And then we have what is required by the FDA for this domain and not CDISC. So moving forward, the FDA TCG should be referred to for that full list of parameters that should be included. The required parameters currently in the SDTMIG are also listed in the FDA TCG. So if you're still using that Appendix C1, that is completely fine. And then the FDA, you should still refer to the FDA TCG because there's more parameters than what's in that appendix. And then also, as I mentioned, that CT relationships document that actually has the full list from CDISC controlled terminology. That would include both what's in the IG and what's in the TCG. Yes, we have time for this last one, which I think I answered a similar question already. Should I include all TS parameters or only applicable for my study? So if you're submitting to the FDA, the list of parameters in the TCG should be included in TS, regardless of whether they're applicable for your study or not. And I think I mentioned before, a lot of those FDA desired parameters in the TCG are simply indicator questions of yes or no. And so if it's not applicable for your study, I would recommend to include it and then have a TS val of N for no. So it looks like we've run out of time, but as I mentioned, any questions that I did not get to, we will answer those and we will post them when we post the slides and the recording to pinnacle21.com on our website. Again, thank you for joining July's webinar, and we hope to talk to you again soon. Thank you.